35,000 Roman soldiers stood in the scorching Mesopotamian desert. Their legs buckled. Their mouths cracked open like dried earth. And they hadn't seen a single enemy arrow. They were dying from something far more terrifying than swords. They were starving. This was 53 BC. This was Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest, most powerful men in Rome, and his entire army was about to disappear into history. But here's what most people don't know: this wasn't a failure of courage. This wasn't Crassus's lack of military talent. This was the catastrophic collapse of something nobody talks about. Something that, if it failed, could bring down empires overnight. His supply lines had broken. And what happened next would teach Rome the most valuable lesson it ever learned. A lesson so powerful that it would eventually make Rome the greatest empire the world has ever seen. You think Rome conquered the world with swords and tactics? You're wrong. Rome conquered the world with grain. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to discover the unglamorous, hidden genius behind Rome's thousand-year dominance. You'll learn why generals feared starvation more than their enemies. Why one forgotten quartermaster was more valuable than 10 brilliant tacticians. And most importantly, you'll learn how understanding this single concept explains Rome's greatest victories and its most humiliating defeats. Because the empire didn't fall when its soldiers stopped fighting. It fell when its kitchens ran out of food. If you've ever wondered what really determines victory in warfare, what really determines success in any massive organization, stick around. Because by the end of this video you'll never look at history, or strategy, the same way again. And if you value deep historical narratives that go beyond the surface-level drama, hit that subscribe button now. This is the kind of story you won't find anywhere else. You've heard of Hannibal, the tactical genius who destroyed Rome at Cannae. You've heard of Caesar, the brilliant commander who conquered Gaul in 8 years. But here's what historians don't tell you: their genius wasn't what happened on the battlefield. It was what happened before the battle ever began. It was the logistics. And once you understand this, you'll realize that every single military defeat in history, every catastrophe, every humiliation, wasn't caused by weak generals or brave enemies. It was caused by one simple failure: the supply line broke. Let me give you some numbers. Real numbers. Numbers that Roman quartermaster officers would have memorized like prayers. A single Roman legion, 5,000 soldiers. Sometimes 6,000. This wasn't a small band of warriors. This was an entire city of armed men. Now, imagine feeding a city. Every single day. Each of those soldiers needed approximately 3,000 calories daily just to maintain basic function. 3,000. That's roughly the equivalent of 2 pounds of grain, wheat or barley, ground into bread or porridge, mixed with legumes, maybe a handful of salted meat if they were lucky. So do the math with me. 5,000 soldiers multiplied by 2 pounds of grain. That's 10,000 pounds per day. Per legion. Over 30 days, that's 300,000 pounds. Or roughly 450 to 500 tons of grain. Per month. For a single legion. Now here's where it gets terrifying. A full military campaign? Rome didn't send one legion. During major campaigns, the empire would deploy anywhere from 5 to 10 legions simultaneously. Sometimes more. So we're talking about 2,000 to 5,000 tons of grain needed monthly across an entire military operation. But the Roman supply wagons, and here's the crucial part, could only carry enough supplies for 2 to 3 days of marching. Not weeks. Not months. 2 to 3 days. This means the army was constantly starving. Constantly dependent on the next supply convoy arriving on time. If that convoy was late by a week, soldiers began collapsing. If it was late by 2 weeks, the army fell apart. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't abstract military strategy. This was survival mathematics. And Roman generals who didn't understand this equation didn't survive long. So here's the fundamental equation that determined the fate of empires. Logistics plus supply equals strategy success. That's it. That's the formula. Most people think Hannibal won at Cannae because of his genius. And yes, his double envelopment tactic, surrounding the Roman army, was brilliant. But here's what people miss. Hannibal's army was better supplied. While Roman generals were pulling soldiers from inadequate supply lines, Hannibal had planned his supply depots perfectly. His soldiers were fed. Roman soldiers were not. Then there's the Battle of Arasium in 105 BC. Rome sent 2 massive armies to fight the Cimbri and Teutons in Gaul. 2 armies. But the commanders, Maximus and Scipio, hated each other. They refused to coordinate. They refused to share supplies. They refused to work together. The result? Instead of two armies supporting each other with shared supply lines, Rome had two separate armies competing for the same limited resources. When the Cimbri attacked, the armies couldn't reinforce each other. They couldn't share food. They fell one at a time. Over 60,000 soldiers died. Not because they were cowards. Not because the enemy was invincible. But because two proud generals refused to cooperate on logistics. And then there's Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus. One of the richest men in Rome. One of the most politically connected. He invaded Parthia with 7 legions, 35,000 soldiers. He chose to march through the Mesopotamian desert instead of taking the safer mountain route through Armenia. What? Pride. Speed. Impatience. But the real reason he died? The desert had no established supply depots. No water sources. No settlements to requisition grain from. His supply wagons got bogged down. His soldiers began dying from thirst and starvation before they even encountered the enemy. When the Parthian archers finally attacked, Crassus's army was already broken. Already dying. It was a massacre. 7 legions ceased to exist. And here's the bitter truth. Crassus lost because he forgot one fundamental rule of warfare. You can be tactically brilliant. You can be the greatest military mind in the world. But if your soldiers are starving, if your supply lines are broken, you will lose. Rome's generals learned this lesson through catastrophe. Again and again. Until finally they understood it. This is where Rome became different from every other power of its time. The barbarian tribes fighting on their home territory? They could live off the land. They fought locally with local knowledge. They didn't need supply chains. They could be chaotic, unprepared, wild. But Rome? Rome was different. Rome projected power across continents. Rome sent armies into enemy territory, into unfamiliar lands, into hostile terrain where they couldn't just forage and hope. Rome had to feed soldiers thousands of miles from home. So Rome did something no other civilization had done before. It systematized logistics. It turned supply chain management into a military discipline. It created permanent supply depots. It built roads specifically for supply wagons. It trained specialists, quartermasters, engineers, supply officers, whose job was purely to keep soldiers fed. And once Rome mastered this, once Rome truly understood that logistics mattered more than tactics, that preparation mattered more than bravery, that the quartermaster mattered more than the general, Rome became unstoppable. The empire that understood the stakes. The empire that mastered bread. That empire mastered the world. This is the lesson that shaped 1,000 years of history. But how exactly did Rome build this system? How did they actually feed armies of 50,000 soldiers across continents for months? And more importantly, what specific mistakes did great commanders make that broke these supply lines? Stay with me. Because the details of this system will blow your mind. And the catastrophes that came from ignoring it? Those stories are about to get a lot darker. So Rome understood the stakes. Rome knew that logistics mattered more than tactics. But understanding something and actually building a system to manage it? Those are two completely different things. What Rome created over centuries wasn't just a supply system. It was a military machine within the military machine. A system so sophisticated, so organized, so perfectly orchestrated that it would become the blueprint for every major military operation for the next 2,000 years. The system had 5 layers. 5 interlocking components that had to work together perfectly. Remove one and the entire machine collapsed. Let me show you how it worked. Every Roman legion had a camp prefect. Not a glamorous position. Not mentioned in triumphal marches or celebrated by emperors. But this man? This man was the logistical brain of the entire legion. Think of him as a chess player. But instead of thinking 3 moves ahead, he's thinking 3 weeks ahead. While the general is planning the next battle, the camp prefect is calculating. How many days' worth of supplies does this legion currently carry? How many more days until the next supply convoy arrives? If we march faster, do we outpace our supplies? If we march slower, do we waste time? He's responsible for selecting every single camp location. And this wasn't random. He had to find places with water sources, essential for drinking, cooking, and hygiene. He had to position camps near supply routes so wagons could reach them. He had to ensure camps were defensible, yet accessible to couriers bringing news and supplies. Every decision he made was a calculation of logistics. And if he calculated wrong, the army starved. A single Roman supply wagon could carry 500 to 1,000 pounds of grain. Sounds impressive until you do the math. A legion of 5,000 soldiers consumed 10,000 pounds of grain daily. So a single wagon was barely a few hours' worth of food for one legion. which is why Rome didn't send one wagon. A legion on campaign required 30 or more supply wagons. 30 wagons, each carrying a ton of grain, coordinated, protected, moving together. But here's what's brilliant: these weren't ad hoc routes. Roman military engineers would survey campaign territories months in advance. They would identify the best paths for supply wagons. They would locate depots at 15 to 20-mile intervals, a day's march for the army. They would build roads if necessary. They would create a supply network before a single soldier set foot in hostile territory. This created a speed versus capacity trade-off. Lighter wagons could move faster but they carried less. Heavier wagons carried more but they slowed down. Rome had to balance this perfectly: fast enough to keep pace with marching armies, yet heavy enough to carry substantial supplies. It was logistics as engineering. And Rome engineered it better than anyone. Imagine a vast network of fortified grain warehouses. Massive storage facilities built at strategic locations across the empire. Coastal ports like Alexandria, river ports on the Rhine and Danube, inland fortifications in key provinces. These were the Horia, the supply depots. A single Horia could hold thousands upon thousands of tons of grain. Rome would fill these depots during peacetime, storing grain for years. When a campaign began, armies would draw from these forward caches. This gave Rome an enormous military advantage. A legion with access to 5 forward depots could operate independently for months. Enemies relying on forage food? They would collapse in weeks. Their soldiers would scatter to find villages to pillage. Their army would fragment. Rome's soldiers? Rome's soldiers stayed fed. Rome's soldiers stayed focused. Rome's soldiers stayed loyal. The Horia weren't just military installations. They became the backbone of Rome's power projection. Wherever Rome built a Horia, Rome could project military power. Every day couriers ran between depots and marching armies. Not just carrying messages, they carried supplies, carried reports, carried critical information about whether the next depot would be ready, whether supplies were running behind schedule. These routes were protected. Small garrison posts established every 15 to 20 miles. Soldiers stationed to guard couriers. Because if a supply convoy was ambushed and destroyed, the next depot wouldn't receive critical supplies. The army would go hungry. A courier could cover 30 to 40 miles per day, which meant supply information from the front could reach Rome in a matter of weeks. And critical supplies could reach an army in days. But here's the danger. If these lines broke, if couriers couldn't get through, if garrison posts were overrun, the supply chain was severed. Armies starved. Empires fell. Rome didn't rely entirely on transported supplies. That would have been logistically impossible. So Rome developed something revolutionary: a system of local acquisition. Military officers called quaestors would move through conquered or allied territories and requisition local grain, livestock, and provisions. Sometimes this was organized trade. Local merchants benefited from selling to Rome's armies. Sometimes it was less voluntary. But here's what's important. This wasn't random pillaging like barbarian tribes. This was organized, systematic, authorized. Rome had the infrastructure and political authority to coordinate this. Rome had military posts throughout its territories that could enforce these requisitions. Rome had records of taxes paid and obligations owed. Barbarian tribes? They couldn't do this. They had no territory to draw from. No established relationship with conquered peoples. No infrastructure for acquiring supplies beyond immediate forage. Rome had all of this. And this advantage, the ability to systematically acquire supplies across vast territories, gave Rome an edge no enemy could match. So that's the architecture. 5 layers working together. Camp prefect calculating, wagons moving, depots stockpiling, couriers communicating, and local officers requisitioning. A perfectly orchestrated system. But this system needed fuel. It needed something to move all those pieces. It needed to feed human beings. And what Roman soldiers actually ate. That's where things get interesting. Let me destroy a romantic fantasy right now. If you think Roman soldiers ate like kings, eating meat and fresh vegetables and living well, stop. That's not what happened. The Roman military diet was brutal in its simplicity. Grain, barley, and wheat made up 60 to 70% of a soldier's daily rations. Not meat. Not fresh produce. Grain. This was the foundation. Ground into flour, made into bread, or cooked as thick porridge. Day after day. Week after week. Month after month. Legumes, beans, and lentils provided protein. These were cheap, they stored for years, they could survive the journey in supply wagons without spoiling. A handful of legumes boiled into the daily porridge. That was protein for most soldiers. Salted pork and dried fish? Rare. Reserved for special occasions or high-ranked officers. The average legionary ate meat maybe once a month if they were lucky. Cheese though? Cheese was different. Portable, long-lasting, substantial. Cheese became a dietary staple that soldiers looked forward to. A block of cheese and hard bread was an acceptable meal. Wine and vinegar? Essential. Wine was as much a part of the ration as grain. Mixed with water, it became sour wine. Cheap, preserved, providing hydration and morale. Soldiers needed alcohol. Not for inebriation but for sanity. After months of monotonous food and constant danger, that daily ration of wine was something to look forward to. Oil for cooking, lighting lamps, and medicinal use. This was included in the ration system as well. Picture a Roman soldier. He wakes up at dawn. He receives his daily ration, roughly 1 pound of grain made into bread or porridge, a handful of legumes, maybe a small portion of meat or cheese, a cup of sour wine. He eats the same meal he ate yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. This monotony was real, and it was dangerous. Not dangerous to his survival, he was getting adequate calories, but dangerous to his morale. Dangerous to his psychological state. Smart generals understood this. They realized that varying the food occasionally, adding dried fruit, changing the grain preparation, including special meals on holidays or after victories, this kept soldiers' spirits high. Monotony was as dangerous to military cohesion as an ambush. That's why some legions thrived under certain commanders and fell apart under others. The difference often came down to supply management and the small morale-boosting touches that went beyond basic rations. Rome didn't just carry grain. Rome carried mobile mills. Grinding equipment traveled with armies. When a legion set up camp, teams of soldiers would grind grain into flour. This flour would be baked fresh daily in camp ovens, and yes, Rome built bakery ovens into permanent camps. Archaeological digs have uncovered remains of these ovens. Fresh bread prevented spoilage. It maintained nutrition. It kept soldiers' morale higher than hard, weeks-old biscuit. For preservation, Rome used everything it knew about chemistry. Salt, smoke. Salted meat lasted 6 to 12 months. Dried fruit and vegetables provided vitamins on long campaigns. Sealed granaries protected grain from moisture and pests. This wasn't guesswork. This was applied science refined over centuries. Every technique had been tested through experience. Every method had been proven to work. But here's the question nobody asks. How much did all of this cost? What was the actual financial burden of feeding Rome's armies? And what strategic decisions did that burden force commanders to make? Feeding an army wasn't Rome's second largest military expense. It wasn't the third largest. It was the largest. 40 to 60% of Rome's entire military budget went to food and logistics. Think about that. Nearly half of every military coin was spent not on swords, not on weapons, not on fortifications. It was spent on bread. A single legion of 5,000 soldiers, maintained for 1 year, cost roughly the equivalent of an entire province's annual tax revenue. 1 legion. 1 year. 1 province's worth of taxes. And that's if the legion was stationed in friendly territory where supplies could be locally acquired. If Rome had to transport supplies across hostile territory, through deserts and mountains, adding months to delivery times, the cost doubled, sometimes tripled. This had real consequences. There were times Rome made peace with enemies not because military victory was impossible, but because continuing the war cost more than making peace. The financial burden of maintaining supply lines across thousands of miles made some wars economically untenable. Rome chose negotiation over continued fighting. Not from weakness but from mathematical reality. And here's something that will shock you. Generals were rewarded or punished based on their supply management, not just their battlefield victories. An emperor would celebrate a general who won a battle efficiently, meaning minimal casualties, minimal supply waste. But an emperor would destroy a general who won a battle expensively, great victories but at the cost of consuming enormous resources. Crassus understood this. Or rather, he didn't. And it killed him. He ignored the cost. He ignored the supply constraints. He pushed into the desert anyway. And the empire watched him fail. This created impossible choices for strategic planners. More supply wagons meant fewer soldiers. You could only fit so much on a march. More soldiers meant more supplies needed, which meant longer supply lines, which meant higher risk of breakage. Which meant vulnerability. Scipio faced this choice in Spain. He chose to take fewer soldiers but ensured they had better supplies. Better equipped. Better fed. Better morale. He won decisively. Varro faced this choice at Cannae. He chose to maximize soldier numbers. Larger army. But stretched supply lines. Inadequate rations. Soldiers hungry before battle even began. He lost catastrophically. The choice was always the same, quantity or quality. And the generals who understood that quality, meaning well-supplied troops, beat quantity, they survived. Those who forgot this equation, history forgot their names, except as cautionary tales. So now you understand the system. 5 layers of logistics. Sophisticated supply chains. Strategic trade-offs between numbers and supplies. Massive financial burdens that determined which wars Rome could afford to fight. But knowing how the system worked when it succeeded? That's only half the story. The real lesson came when the system broke. When commanders ignored these principles. When supply lines failed. When Rome's greatest generals faced the question they never wanted to answer. What happens when the supplies stop arriving? Rome built this beautiful, intricate system. 5 layers of logistics. Depots and couriers and supply wagons all working together. It was a masterpiece of organization. But masterpieces are fragile. Because 3 times in Roman history, great commanders made catastrophic choices. 3 times, generals with talent, with armies, with ambition, decided that they knew better than the system. They deviated. They took shortcuts. They ignored the first rule of ancient warfare. And 3 times the system took its revenge. These aren't just stories of defeat. These are stories of annihilation. These are tales of how 35,000 soldiers can vanish into the desert. How an entire army can disappear in a forest. How the best-equipped legions in the world can be destroyed, not by superior tactics, but by the simple, brutal failure of a supply line. Let me show you what happens when logistics breaks. Marcus Licinius Crassus was not a man accustomed to failure. He was one of the 3 most powerful men in Rome, part of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey. While Caesar conquered Gaul and Pompey swept pirates from the Mediterranean, Crassus had only one accomplishment to his name: suppressing the Spartacus rebellion. It wasn't enough. Crassus wanted glory. Military glory. The kind that made emperors. The kind that made history. So in 53 BC, he decided to invade Parthia, the great Eastern Empire. He dreamed of repeating the successes of Alexander the Great. He wanted conquest. He wanted legacy. He gathered 7 legions. 35,000 soldiers. And he marched east. Now his Armenian ally, a king whose kingdom lay on the route to Parthia, came to him and said, "There is a safe route through the mountains of Armenia. High passes, difficult terrain but established. Safe. Known." But Crassus looked at that route and saw delay. He looked at those mountains and saw time wasted. He wanted speed. He wanted to arrive in Parthia before anyone could mobilize against him. So he chose the direct route. Through the Mesopotamian desert. He made a choice that would kill 35,000 men. The desert had no water sources. No settlements where soldiers could forage. No established supply depots because Rome had never projected power this far east into hostile, unfamiliar territory. Crassus's supply wagons, which worked perfectly on Roman roads with established infrastructure, became useless in sand. Heavy, laden with grain and supplies, they bogged down. They moved at a crawl. They fell behind. The soldiers began with confidence. They were Romans. They were legionaries. They had defeated every enemy they faced. But confidence doesn't sustain you when there's no water. Doesn't keep you alive when your throat is cracked open like dried leather. Days became weeks. The sand stretched endlessly. Soldiers collapsed from dehydration. Others collapsed from starvation as supplies dwindled. They hadn't seen a single Parthian archer yet, and they were dying anyway. When the Parthian army finally appeared, light cavalry, mounted archers, a completely different type of warfare that Roman legionaries had never encountered, Crassus's soldiers were already broken, starving, dehydrated, demoralized. What happened next was a massacre. The Parthians surrounded the Roman square. Thousands of mounted archers began firing arrows in an endless rain. The Romans couldn't counterattack. The light cavalry retreated constantly, firing as they retreated. It was a tactic Rome had never seen. It was devastation. Crassus was forced to negotiate. During negotiations he was captured and executed. 7 legions ceased to exist. Their battle standards, the sacred eagles, were captured. Entire units were annihilated. The survivors? Scattered, enslaved, lost to history. 35,000 soldiers entered the desert. Maybe 1,000 returned. And why? Because one man decided that supply lines were less important than speed. One man ignored the first rule: never fight where you can't be supplied. Crassus paid for that decision with his life. His soldiers paid with theirs. But Carey wasn't the only catastrophe. Because sometimes the failure wasn't just one man's pride. Sometimes it was internal conflict. Two commanders fighting each other as much as the enemy. And when they did, their supply lines fragmented. And their army shattered. At the end of the 2nd century BC, Rome faced a terrifying threat from the north. The Cimbri and Teutons, Germanic tribes numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were migrating across Europe like a plague of locusts, sweeping away everything, conquering everything. Rome sent 2 armies to Gaul to stop them. One commanded by Gaius Marius Maximus, who held the rank of consul, meaning he had supreme military authority. The other commanded by Quintus Servilius Scipio, a proconsul from one of Rome's most distinguished noble families. Now, Scipio looked at Maximus and saw a new man, not from the old aristocracy. Scipio despised him for it. So Scipio refused to obey orders, refused to coordinate, refused to cooperate. The 2 armies set up camps on opposite banks of the Rhone River. They were maybe 10 miles apart. Close enough to support each other. Close enough to share supplies. But instead of working together, they became enemies. Scipio refused to move his camp, refused to cross the river, refused to share the burden of supply acquisition. And Maximus, frustrated, couldn't force cooperation. When the Cimbri and Teutons learned of this division, they saw opportunity. They sent peace envoys to Maximus. Negotiations began. But Scipio, terrified that Maximus would gain all the glory if negotiations succeeded, decided to act. Without informing the consul. Without coordinating. He attacked the Cimbri camp. Alone. It was a disaster. His army was destroyed. Completely annihilated. Then the victorious Cimbri descended on Maximus's camp. Now facing overwhelming odds, now lacking the support that Scipio's army could have provided, Maximus's legions were also destroyed. Both armies gone. The combined casualty count exceeded 60,000. An entire generation of Roman soldiers dead. What? Not because the Cimbri were invincible. Not because Roman tactics had failed. But because 2 commanders let personal pride override military necessity. They couldn't coordinate supplies. They couldn't support each other. They fought separately and died separately. This defeat shocked Rome. It showed that Rome's greatest weakness wasn't external enemies. It was internal division. And it forced the empire to completely restructure its command system. From that moment on, supply management became centralized. One quartermaster. One system. No competing chains of command. No divided loyalties. But even centralized supply management couldn't protect Rome from commanders who made catastrophic choices. Because in 9 AD, a governor named Varus made a choice that would devastate 3 legions. He chose to take a shortcut through a forest. A shortcut with no supply depots. No established routes. No infrastructure. And that shortcut led straight into a trap. Publius Quintilius Varus was the Roman governor in Germany. He was competent enough as an administrator, but he trusted the wrong person. His chief advisor was a young Germanic chieftain named Arminius. Now, Arminius had been granted Roman citizenship. He had served in the Roman army. He had learned Roman tactics, Roman discipline, Roman warfare. He seemed loyal. He seemed trustworthy. But he was secretly preparing a massive uprising of the Germanic tribes. In the fall of 9 AD, Varus was returning to his winter quarters with 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th. About 15,000 soldiers. Maybe more with auxiliaries and baggage trains. Arminius came to Varus and said, "There's a local uprising to the north. We need to go suppress it." Varus believed him. And Arminius convinced him to leave the established roads. To take a shortcut through the forests and swamps of the Teutoburg region. Unfamiliar territory. No cleared paths. No supply depots. No infrastructure. This was by design. As soon as the Roman column entered the dense forest, it fell into a carefully prepared ambush. The legions were stretched out for miles along a narrow path through mud and trees. Heavy rain had turned the ground into swamp. Movement was slow. Formation was impossible. The Germanic tribes hiding in the forest launched simultaneous attacks along the entire length of the column. The Romans, trained to fight in open formation, couldn't adapt. The forest and swamps neutralized their greatest strength, their ability to fight as a unified, disciplined unit. For 3 days the Romans were trapped. They tried to break through. They built improvised fortifications at night. But they had no supplies arriving. No reinforcements. No way out. They were surrounded. demoralized, starving. On the third day the legions were finally destroyed. Quintilius Varus, rather than face capture, committed suicide. 3 legions ceased to exist. The battle standards, the sacred eagles, were captured. But here's what matters most. This wasn't because the Germans were militarily superior. It was because Varus had ignored the fundamental rule of warfare. He had taken soldiers into territory with no established supply lines. No depots. No infrastructure. He had marched them into a forest where supplies couldn't reach them. Starving soldiers can't fight. Demoralized soldiers can't fight. And that's what Varus's legions became. The consequences were enormous. Rome abandoned its plans to create a German province. The Roman border was established along the Rhine. And the 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were never reactivated. Their numbers were retired. They became eternal reminders of the catastrophe in the Teutoburg forest. Rome would not attempt expansion into Germany again for 500 years. Not because Germans were unconquerable, but because Rome couldn't sustain the supply lines required to hold such distant, unfamiliar territory. 3 catastrophes. 3 commanders. 3 ways that supply lines failed. Crassus chose speed over infrastructure and marched into a desert where supplies couldn't reach him. His pride killed 35,000 soldiers. Maximus and Scipio let internal conflict fragment their supply chain. Their ego killed 60,000 soldiers. Varus trusted the wrong man and took a shortcut through territory with no supply depots. His naivety killed 15,000 soldiers. All 3 shared the same fatal flaw. They focused on tactics, on strategy, on the immediate problem. They forgot about logistics. They forgot about the unglamorous, invisible system that kept armies alive. And that forgetting cost them everything. But Rome learned. Rome adapted. Because these catastrophes weren't just defeats. They were lessons. Harsh, brutal, expensive lessons written in the blood of soldiers. And the lessons Rome learned from these failures? They transformed Rome from a regional power into an empire that would dominate the world for 1,000 years. That's the real story of Rome's success. It wasn't born from victory. It was forged in the fire of disaster. All 3 shared the same fatal flaw. They focused on tactics, strategy, the immediate problem. They forgot about logistics. This ties back to Section 2's thesis and sets up Section 5's triumph. Rome learned. Rome adapted. And that learning transformed Rome into a 1,000-year empire. So Rome learned. Rome adapted. Because those catastrophes, Crassus, Erasium, Teutoburg, they weren't the end of Rome's story. They were the beginning of Rome's transformation. Rome took the lessons written in the blood of soldiers and turned them into a new doctrine. A new approach. A new understanding of what it meant to wage war across continents. And when Rome finally mastered logistics, when Rome truly understood that supply lines were the foundation of empire, Rome became unstoppable. This is where the story shifts, from catastrophe to brilliance, from failure to mastery. Let me show you what Rome did when it got this right. Julius Caesar. The name that defines military genius. When we think of Caesar, we think of brilliant tactics. We think of victories against overwhelming odds. We think of a man who could see the battlefield before the battle was fought. But here's what we don't think about: grain. Caesar spent 8 years conquering Gaul. 8 years against continuous resistance. 8 years against tens of thousands of Gallic warriors. 8 years in foreign territory far from Rome. And do you know why he succeeded where Crassus failed? Where Varus failed? Where so many others collapsed? Because Caesar understood that battles weren't won in the moment of combat. They were won months before in the planning of supply lines. Caesar established forward supply depots 30 days march ahead of his armies. 30 days ahead. Think about that. While his soldiers were marching in one region, Caesar's engineers were already preparing depots in the next region. Building granaries. Stockpiling grain. Creating the infrastructure that would feed his legions weeks before they arrived. But that wasn't all. Caesar's officers, the quaestors responsible for local acquisition, were negotiating with merchants. They were contracting for grain from local suppliers. They were securing grain stores from allies. They weren't just taking supplies, they were systematically acquiring them through an organized network. This gave Caesar flexibility. It distributed the burden across multiple suppliers. It meant that if one supply chain was disrupted, others could compensate. And then there were the rivers. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine. Caesar used these rivers as aquatic highways. Boats could carry 10 times more supplies than wagons. 10 times. A single riverboat could carry what would take 5 wagons. And riverboats didn't get bogged down in mud. didn't struggle with terrain. They flowed downstream carrying tons of grain to legions stationed along the banks. Caesar organized rotating supply convoys. Different teams of soldiers took turns carrying supplies forward. This meant the men weren't constantly exhausted from carrying loads. Fresh legs meant faster movement. Faster movement meant supplies arrived on schedule. And every 15 miles, Caesar established courier stations. These weren't just for messages. They were supply checkpoints, communication hubs. Points where supply status was constantly updated, constantly monitored, constantly adjusted. Let me give you the numbers that tell the real story. Caesar's armies averaged 50,000 soldiers. 50,000. Fighting in Gaul for 8 years. And do you know how many died of starvation? How many collapsed from malnutrition? Minimal. Nearly none. Compare that to his enemies, the Gallic tribes. They had no infrastructure. No depots. No river routes. As campaigns dragged on, they grew weaker. Hungry. Desperate. Caesar's soldiers? Caesar's soldiers grew stronger with each passing season because the supply system became more refined, more efficient, more powerful. Here's what Caesar understood that others didn't. You don't defeat enemies in one brilliant battle. You defeat them through superior preparation. An army that's well-fed, confident in supplies, knows it can sustain campaigns for years. An army that's hungry, desperate, knows it will collapse in weeks. After a successful battle, Caesar's soldiers were ready to march within days. They knew the next depot was waiting. They knew supplies were guaranteed. They moved with confidence. The Gallic tribes? They needed months to recover from a battle. Months to gather new forces. Months to rebuild. And by then, Caesar had already moved to a new region, established new depots, organized new supply chains. The conquest was inevitable. Not because Caesar's soldiers were braver or more skilled, but because Caesar had built a machine that never stopped. That was Caesar's true genius. Not the tactics, the logistics. But Caesar's genius was learned from studying commanders like Scipio Africanus, a man who faced the greatest general in history, Hannibal himself, and beat him through one simple principle. Scipio refused to overextend his supplies, and because of that, Hannibal could never beat him. Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal, the greatest tactical mind in ancient warfare, defeated. And most people think it was because Scipio was tactically superior, clever, more brilliant in the moment of battle. They're wrong. Scipio won because he understood supply management better than Hannibal, because he had the discipline to refuse victory if it meant overextending supplies. During the Second Punic War, Scipio established supply depots across Spain and Africa. He calculated exactly how many soldiers he could support in each region. Not how many he wished he could support. Not how many would look impressive. But exactly how many his supply lines could sustain. Then he did something remarkable. He turned down reinforcements. Rome sent additional legions offering to join his campaign. More soldiers. More manpower. More ways to crush Hannibal quickly. And Scipio refused. He said, "I don't have the supply infrastructure to support them." Think about that. A commander turning down reinforcements. Turning down the chance for faster victory. Because he understood that adding soldiers without adding supply depots would collapse the system. Would starve his army. Would guarantee defeat. Scipio knew that 20,000 well-fed soldiers would beat 30,000 hungry ones every time. Then came the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. The decisive confrontation between Rome and Carthage. Hannibal had just marched across North Africa. His supply lines were stretched thin. His soldiers were exhausted from weeks of travel. His horses were dying from lack of forage. Scipio's army was fresh, well-supplied, stationed in friendly territory, rested. The battle wasn't decided when swords clashed. It was decided before a single sword was drawn. It was won by who had grain. It was won by who had rest. It was won by who understood that logistics determines victory. Hannibal was a genius. But Scipio was a genius with a full stomach and a well-stocked granary. And that made all the difference. But Caesar and Scipio were great generals working with temporary supply networks. Campaign by campaign. Region by region. What if Rome could create a permanent system? A network of depots that covered the entire empire? A supply infrastructure so vast, so comprehensive, that any army could be fed anywhere, anytime? Rome did. And it changed everything. Horia. Supply depots. Massive granaries built at strategic locations across the empire. Coastal ports like Alexandria, river ports on the Rhine and Danube, inland fortifications in key provinces. But here's what's astounding. Rome didn't just build these for military purposes. These Horia served dual purposes. They stored grain for military campaigns. But they also supported trade. They supplied civilian populations. During famines they fed entire cities. This created something unique. A network so vast, so comprehensive, that it became the nervous system of the entire empire. Hundreds of Horia. Thousands of tons of grain. Connected by roads and rivers. Managed by local administrators who tracked inventory meticulously. Preventing shortages. Preventing waste. Rotating grain so old stock was used first, preventing spoilage. And grain prices across the empire were regulated through this system. No province could exploit another. No region could hoard. Rome maintained stability through logistics infrastructure. But the military advantage was staggering. Rome could mobilize armies anywhere in the empire and feed them. An enemy attacking the frontier? Rome could move 3 legions to that location within weeks. The Horia network meant those legions would have supplies waiting. No delay. No starvation. No vulnerability. This created a virtuous cycle that became unstoppable. Soldiers knew they would be fed. Morale soared. Better morale meant better performance. Better performance meant more victories. More victories meant more resources flowing back to Rome. More resources meant the Horia network could be expanded and improved. Meanwhile, enemies looked at Rome and saw an opponent that had unlimited supplies. Unlimited reinforcements. Unlimited staying power. The psychological demoralization was complete before battles even began. This was Rome's ultimate secret. Not swords. Not tactics. Not courage. Infrastructure. The Horia network. The system of logistics that made Rome unstoppable. An empire built on grain. 1,000-year dominion sustained by bread. Whoever controlled the supplies controlled the empire. From the catastrophes of Crassus, Erasium and Teutoburg, Rome learned. Rome adapted. Rome transformed its failures into a system so sophisticated, so powerful, that it became the foundation of the greatest empire in history. Caesar used it to conquer Gaul. Scipio used it to defeat Hannibal. Rome used it to conquer the known world. But empires, no matter how great, are fragile. No matter how perfect the system, it can collapse. And Rome's supply system? Eventually it would fail. Not from external pressure. Not from military defeat. But from internal decay. Economic exhaustion. The slow, inevitable breakdown of the infrastructure that held everything together. And when that system failed, when the Horia couldn't be maintained, when Rome could no longer afford to feed its armies, that's when the empire fell. That's the story we need to tell next. Rome built the greatest supply system ever created. A network so perfect, so sophisticated, that it sustained an empire for 1,000 years. But here's the tragic truth. The same system that made Rome great eventually became the thing that destroyed it. Because systems only work when you can afford to maintain them. And by the 3rd century AD, Rome couldn't afford anything anymore. The empire began to collapse. Not from military weakness. Not from cowardice. But from something far more insidious: starvation. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was doing something it had never attempted before. Fighting wars on multiple fronts simultaneously. Germany on the north. Mesopotamia on the east. North Africa on the south. And internal rebellions everywhere. This is when Rome discovered something terrifying. Logistics has limits. Feeding an army in Germany required one supply chain. Feeding an army in Mesopotamia required another. Feeding an army in North Africa required yet another. And all 3 had to be maintained at the same time. All 3 competing for resources. All 3 draining the imperial treasury. The mathematics became impossible. To feed 50,000 soldiers in Germany cost X amount of grain and X amount of gold. To feed 50,000 in Mesopotamia cost the same. To feed 50,000 in North Africa cost the same. Now multiply that by 3. The cost tripled. The demands tripled. The logistics infrastructure required tripled. Rome couldn't afford it. So what happened? Inflation. As military spending increased, prices across the empire rose. A pound of grain cost more. Soldiers' wages had to increase to keep pace. Logistics officers had to requisition more supplies to maintain the same army. The empire spent more and more gold to maintain the same number of soldiers. To pay for this, Rome raised taxes. The provinces, already exhausted by supporting armies, now faced even higher tax burdens. Resentment grew. Rebellion sparked. Provinces that had been peaceful for centuries suddenly revolted. This created a vicious cycle. Rebellions disrupted supply routes. Disrupted supply lines meant armies couldn't be fed properly. Hungry armies performed poorly. Poor performance meant battles were lost. Lost battles meant more territories fell to barbarians. Fewer territories meant fewer taxes. Fewer taxes meant the empire had even less money to fund logistics. Less funding meant armies got hungrier. Hungrier armies meant more defeats. It was a death spiral. And Rome was caught in it. By the time Rome realized what was happening, it was too late to reverse. The system that had made Rome unstoppable became the mechanism of Rome's destruction. And then came Adrianople. In 378 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire faced the Goths on the frontier. A Roman army marched out under Emperor Valens. But something was different. The soldiers were thin, undernourished. The supply lines to the frontier had been so depleted, so stretched, that soldiers hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Starving soldiers are desperate soldiers. Desperate soldiers make poor tactical decisions. They panic easily. They break formation quickly. When the Goths attacked, the Roman legions, the finest soldiers in the world, couldn't hold. They broke. They scattered. They were destroyed. Emperor Valens himself died on that battlefield. This wasn't a defeat because Rome's soldiers were cowardly. This was a defeat because Rome couldn't feed them. The empire that had conquered the known world through superior logistics now couldn't maintain its own supply lines. The irony was complete. Rome fell not because its enemies became stronger. Rome fell because Rome became too poor to buy bread. But economic exhaustion was only half the story. Because Rome didn't just run out of money. Rome also ran out of territory. The territories that fed Rome. The provinces that provided grain. They fell. One by one. And when Rome lost control of North Africa, the final blow came. North Africa was Rome's breadbasket. Egypt, the grain-producing territories of modern Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, these provinces were where Rome got most of its grain. The Horea in Alexandria and Carthage were the heart of the empire's food supply. These depots fed not just armies. They fed Rome itself. They fed the capital. They kept the empire alive. Then the Vandals took control. By 455 AD, North Africa was a Vandal kingdom. Rome no longer controlled the grain supply. Rome no longer had access to the harvest that sustained the empire. Without North Africa's grain, the supply system collapsed. The Hoary networks meant nothing if there was no grain to store in them. The logistical genius that had built an empire became useless. In 410 AD, Alaric and the Goths sacked Rome. The city, weakened by a long siege, couldn't resist. Why? Because Rome couldn't provision itself. The supplies ran out. The city was starved into submission. Then came 455 AD. Vandals approached Rome. And what happened? The same thing. Rome was starved. Not by superior military force. By hunger. The city that had ruled the world fell because it couldn't feed itself. The irony was devastating. Rome's greatest strength, its supply system, had become its greatest vulnerability. Because when that system was disrupted, Rome had no alternative. It collapsed. But here's what's most tragic. Rome knew better. Rome had learned these lessons. From Crassus, from Erasium, from Teutoburg, Rome had learned that logistics mattered. Yet by the end Rome had forgotten. And in that forgetting the empire died. Rome's rise was built on a single understanding. Logistics matters more than tactics. From the catastrophes of the early years, Rome learned that armies don't win battles with courage alone. They win by being prepared. By being fed. By having infrastructure. For 1,000 years this wisdom held. But by the late empire this understanding vanished. Generals focused on tactics, on immediate battles. They forgot about supplies. They forgot about depots. They forgot about the unglamorous, invisible system that had made Rome great. The result? Defeats that could have been prevented. Battles lost not because enemies were stronger, but because Roman soldiers were starving. Adrianople is the perfect example. A battle lost because soldiers couldn't be fed. A battle that changed history. A battle that accelerated Rome's fall. Here's the tragic lesson. Even the greatest systems fail when people forget the foundations they were built on. Rome didn't fall because its enemies were invincible. Rome fell because Rome forgot what made Rome, Rome. Rome forgot that success isn't about one brilliant moment. It's about consistent, unglamorous preparation. It's about bread. So here we stand at the end of Rome's story. The empire that ruled for 1,000 years fell not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not defeated in glorious battle, but starved into surrender. From Crassus in the desert to the Vandals at Rome's gates, the story is the same. Logistics determines destiny. This isn't just Roman history. This is the story of every empire, every organization, every person striving for success. Because the lesson Rome learned, too late, applies to everything. Success is built on foundations, on infrastructure, on consistent preparation, on unglamorous systems maintained day after day, year after year. Visionary moments matter. Brilliant tactics matter. But they matter only if the foundation is strong. Ignore the logistics of your life and you'll collapse like Rome collapsed. Maintain them and you become unstoppable. This is what Rome's story teaches. And it's a lesson that resonates across 2,000 years. We've traveled through 20 centuries of history. We've watched Rome rise from a small city-state to the greatest empire the world has ever known. We've seen it learn from catastrophe. We've watched it build a system so powerful that it seemed invincible. And we've witnessed it collapse, not from external conquest, but from forgetting its own wisdom. But before we end this story, there's one group of people we need to talk about. People who almost nobody remembers. People whose names were never carved into monuments. People whose brilliance shaped history just as much as any emperor or general. These were the people Rome forgot to celebrate. And they might just be the most important people in Rome's entire story. Every time you read about Caesar conquering Gaul, remember, there was a quartermaster whose name history doesn't know, calculating supply routes months in advance, making sure bread would be waiting. Every time you read about Scipio defeating Hannibal, remember, there were supply officers requisitioning grain, managing depots, ensuring soldiers would be fed. Their names aren't in the history books. Every loaf of bread that fed a Roman soldier was a small victory against chaos. Every supply convoy that arrived on time was an act of brilliance. Every depot that kept grain from spoiling was an invisible triumph. The real story of Rome's dominance isn't the story of generals on horseback. It's the story of thousands of people doing unglamorous, essential work. Quartermasters, engineers, administrators, supply officers, the people nobody celebrates. Here's what I want you to consider. Who are the quartermasters in your life? Think about it. Who are the people doing essential preparation while others seek glory? Who are the ones maintaining systems while everyone watches the dramatic moments? Just as Rome's supply officers were forgotten in history, we often forget the essential workers in our own lives. The people who prepare, who organize, who ensure things run smoothly behind the scenes. Maybe it's time to change that. Maybe it's time to recognize the quartermasters in your own life. The unsung heroes who make everything possible. But beyond recognizing these people, Rome's story teaches us something deeper. 3 lessons. 3 truths that echo across 2,000 years. 3 principles that determine success in warfare, in business, in life. In warfare, in business, in life, the prepared person beats the talented unprepared person every single time. Rome didn't have inherently better soldiers than the Gauls or the Germans. Rome had better preparation. Rome had a system. And that system made all the difference. Think about your own life. Talent is wonderful. But talent without preparation is just potential. Preparation is power. What you build before the crisis determines how you survive the crisis. The Horia system wasn't visible. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't win battles or conquer territory. But it was Rome's greatest weapon. Everything great is built on unglamorous infrastructure. Every business is built on supply chains and systems. Every successful life is built on routines and preparation. The visible achievements rest on invisible foundations. Rome's supply system worked because everyone followed procedure. Everyone understood their role. Everyone trusted the system. But the moment commanders deviated, when Crassus chose the desert route, when Varus took the shortcut, the system broke. Trust the system. Especially when you're tempted to improvise. Especially when you think you know better. Because the system exists for a reason. It exists because brilliant people learned from failure. Now you might be thinking, this is interesting history, but what does it have to do with me? I'm not fighting battles. I'm not leading armies. I'm just living my life. Exactly. And that's why this matters more than you think. These same principles that determined Rome's fate determine everything today. Modern militaries dominate based on logistics, not courage. The wealthiest nations with the best supply chains win wars. Logistics is why. Always has been. Always will be. In business? Amazon doesn't dominate because they have the best products. Amazon dominates because they have the best supply chain. The best logistics. The best infrastructure. Everything else follows from that. In your personal life? Your performance doesn't come from talent alone. It comes from the systems you maintain. Your nutrition. Your sleep. Your exercise. your planning, your daily preparation. Rome's story isn't ancient history. Rome's story is your story. We all succeed or fail based on the same equation. Logistics determines destiny. Whether you're fighting wars, building businesses, or building a life, the principle is identical. Preparation beats talent. Infrastructure is strategy. Systems require discipline. Rome's story is humanity's story. We succeed through unglamorous preparation. Not in dramatic moments, but in countless quiet moments of showing up, preparing, maintaining systems. If this video has shown you something new about history, about strategy, about what it really takes to build something great, something that lasts, I want to ask you 3 things. First, like this video. If you've learned that the unglamorous details of preparation matter more than the dramatic moments, hit that like button. Show the algorithm that deep historical narratives resonate with you. Second, share this video with someone you know. Share it with someone who thinks success comes from talent alone. Share it with someone who needs to understand that preparation beats brilliance every time. Share it with someone who needs to recognize the quartermasters in their own life. Third, comment below. Tell me this. What's the most important supply line in your life? What's the unglamorous system that keeps you functioning? Is it your daily routine? Your relationships? Your work discipline? What invisible infrastructure are you maintaining that keeps you going? I read every comment and I want to hear your answer. And finally, if you value deep historical narratives that go beyond surface-level drama, that dig into the real forces that shape civilizations, subscribe now. Hit that notification bell. Because history channels talk about battles and generals. But we dive deeper. We explore the real story. The story of how bread matters more than glory. The story of how the unglamorous systems determine empires. Rome fell. But its lessons remain. The empire that understood that logistics mattered lasted 1,000 years. That's not just history. That's wisdom. History isn't about the dramatic moments. History is about the countless quiet moments of preparation. The small victories against chaos. The unglamorous work that makes greatness possible. And in those quiet moments lies the real story of civilization. A story we need to tell. A story we need to remember. A story that might just change how you see everything.